Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk a bit about a book from the Women's Prize shortlist, Isabella Hammad's Enter Ghost. I will be sort of trying to do at least reviews for most of the, or if not all of the Women's Prize shortlist for fiction, sort of individual videos, and I'll do sort of a roundup one as well. But I've literally just finished reading this, so I really wanted to talk about it while it was still fresh in my mind. I will go into some spoilers. I'll sort of say when that bit is about to come. But the first bit of this video should be relatively spoiler-free. I'll keep it to sort of what's either in the synopsis or is kind of within the first few pages, really, or kind of a broad overview of the book. But let's get started. So first up, the non-spoilery bit. So the book itself is concerned with a young woman called Sonia, and she is a young woman, Palestinian, and lives in the UK, who is invited to be part of a production of Hamlet being performed in the West Bank. And so this sort of immediately sort of sets up these sorts of tensions and sort of potential sources of conflict within the book around this sort of idea of such a politically charged area putting on a play kind of in the first place, but equally the fact that the ways that Israel and Palestine kind of can be viewed as sort of relating to characters or moments within the play itself. And Hamlet is one of those plays that I've not read for a while, but it was interesting to kind of see how this book kind of recontextualizes parts of it, or at least has that as a big part of it. And quite early on in the book, we have a discussion from some of the characters talking about who various characters might represent. Some characters are convinced, well, this character is clearly a sort of, in this context could be a cipher for Palestine or for Israel. This character could be a cipher for a certain political figure or what have you. But the beginning part of the book especially is Sonia trying to just sort of navigate her various kind of conflicting opinions about returning to Palestine, and also the kind of the difficulties she finds about the relationships between her and other people around her. This is a performance that's going to take place in Arabic, and that itself is also sort of a source of controversy. People sort of talk about how, that sort of again might potentially come with its own sort of politically charged feel, sort of taking place within the West Bank and various other things within the play. But really, the first part of this book is really concerned with her kind of lead up to this. The rehearsals, her sort of interpersonal relationships, her relationships with her family. Quite early in the book, we get a border crossing, and that again is sort of a politically charged thing where some people have certain permits or certain access, and it's kind of incredibly conflicting. What I will say, without sort of going into more of the plot, I think there's a lot of this book that I want to talk about that will need spoilers in effect, just because I think this book very much builds towards a certain end. But the sort of, I think just as a book itself, I just found it incredibly lyrical and beautiful. I thought it was really profound in the ways that it looks at the lead up to the putting on of this play and the various things that complicate matters. So again, without spoiling anything, her sort of role as somebody who's been in the UK has also meant that at one point she meets another person from the UK, but who is almost on the sort of other side from her in terms of a border crossing. And that sort of throws up this other kind of conflict internally for her about how she feels sort of betrayed by somebody on a sort of British level for then kind of perpetrating some of these same tensions in the West Bank and sort of around that area. So it's a really complex book in that sense, but I think just it's so confident and bold in its voice. So much of this book is about these really in-depth interpersonal relationships. So that the kind of the politics, the wider politics of Israel, Palestine, the West Bank, various other things come into this book, definitely. But so much of this book is about those sort of the subtleties of interpersonal relationships between the characters. A lot of it is just sort of how Sonia feels both, betrayed by people around her and welcomed with this sense of community and the kind of the inner conflict she has. And I think that is a really pivotal part of this book that I found utterly beautiful and really thought-provoking. All of which then leads into the wider thing. And this is a really hard book to discuss without going into sort of the later part of it, because I think that's where I think this book sets up the chess pieces fairly early for kind of this sort of quite dynamic end. And I want to talk a little bit about that, so I will go into spoilers. But what I will just say as a sort of an initial thing, if you're sort of worried going into this book that you maybe don't know sort of enough about the situation, I don't think it's necessary for the book. I think so much of this book is either sort of seeks to explain parts of that, but also is looking from a wider lens at the kind of parallels of sort of political power, sort of wider things around social and sort of interpersonal relationships, and the ways that some of those become fraught with sort of things around you. And I just think it's also just this, really lyrical, really bold, thoughtful story that is just really beautiful in many, many ways as well. And I really loved it. I think it's a really powerful book, but I can't really discuss much about it without going into some spoilers. So do check it out if it sounds like it'd be of interest. And just to know, I'll be pulling down the spoiler curtain in just a second, or pulling up. Either way, if you do need to drop off here, thank you for stopping by, but let's talk a bit more about everything else in the book. So with the spoilers, spoiler territory that we're now in, this book builds, as you know, as the plot would seem to suggest, towards this performance in the West Bank. And in the lead up, we have all of these really difficult things in terms of interpersonal relationships. We have characters who fall apart and kind of fall in love with each other and various other things. We have a series of escalating tensions in the book. At one point, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is sort of there's an attack, and what that means is that place is briefly closed off to everybody else around, particularly to Palestinian or kind of Arab folk. And what that sort of starts to mean is the sort of political tension around the play becomes more complicated once news is sort of, once it hits the news that this play is about to be put on, it suddenly becomes more and more of a thing where people are really nervous about what that means. If the play was just performed to 20, 30 people, it would still be important in its own way, but it being visible, it being a thing where, as we find out, dignitaries come along to it, sort of ministers, various other people come along, that sort of suddenly puts a lot more stress and strain on this. And that has an impact on the actors themselves, who sort of absorb a lot of this tension. And actually what this book really plays at, I think really interestingly, is how the characters then use some of that tension or some of the political atmosphere around them to enhance the role. And at first that's sort of presented as quite a positive thing of, isn't it great that these characters are able to pour all of their humanness into the characters? But actually we realize that comes at a cost, that actually reliving your trauma and reliving various painful things in your life to be a better actor is not as sort of dignified as that makes it sound. This is actually something where actors would rather not have to have gone through the various things that happen to them in order to be able to, give a more convincing performance of living under oppression or what have you. And so this book, I think, does something really quite interesting as a way of flipping parts of this, because we sort of see how we're building towards this final performance of Hamlet. And in that play, there are many either sort of soliloquies or various other parts where the audience is really encouraged to see themselves as being part of something against an oppressor. That there are quite a few moments in the play where the audience is appealed to, or there is a reference to an audience. And actually the book also plays with this as well. So in Hamlet, you almost have that slightly meta thing of the audience being referred to, when typically, you have some moments in Shakespeare plays where the audience is referred to, but Hamlet sometimes has sort of a few elements of this where it's almost within a play. And they also, at one point in this book, reference a play within a play. I'm not sure actually if it's a real one or a fictional one, but that idea sort of looms large in this book, the sort of idea that you can have a story within a story, potentially within a story. So Hamlet already has some element of this. There's a reference to another play. All of this is being housed within a book here that is also referencing a play. And so you've got these various overlapping elements to the book that I think made it really rich and really complex in a really beautiful way. And all of this culminates in that performance, the first performance. And you've got these dignitaries there, and suddenly Israeli soldiers enter and are sort of waiting in the wings. And this is where some of the soliloquies in the play that really reference sort of oppressors or really reference violence or what have you, start to take on a new meaning for the characters. And we see how the actors deliver their lines with this real intensity, because actually there's something very real about what's happening in the room. The audience sort of is described as sort of responding to this, sort of noting the tension in the room as certain lines get delivered. At one point, there's a half gesture towards the soldiers, with an acknowledgement that actually this play goes far beyond the words being said on stage. This is a real thing. Everything is very real suddenly, and the play is more than just a piece of imaginative fiction or a piece of entertainment happening on stage. There is a real thing going on behind it, all of which I think is deeply powerful and deeply moving. And the book then extends that idea of this sort of courage of being on stage, speaking to the people who are also in this situation with them, both to the audience and to the Israeli guards and to the Palestinian sort of dignitaries, and just it's sort of everyone in that room is sort of part of this. The play they reference in the book also has this idea of everybody sort of being part of the problem and potentially the solution, but also not the solution, and all these other things. And I think it's really interesting the way the book kind of contextualizes and recontextualizes and sort of creates this sort of meta narrative about the idea of where art and politics intersect. So actually, is it enough to just create a play or a piece of art about a struggle? Do you need to be stopping the struggle itself, or is the art a piece of the resistance against it? And this book sort of enters the fray as well as part of that. It's not only a commentary on that as an idea, but also potentially offering itself as, is this book enough? Is it, can this be considered somebody's role? And at one point there's a discussion about whether, being an actor should be a paid thing in the same way, like a full-time job, or actually should it be a voluntary thing that you do because art is worth something by itself, and art doesn't need to be a full-time job to be valid. And all of these other conversations enter the fray. And I think it's so poignantly done, and it builds towards this really deep end. And actually, I think what I found really powerful about the ending here is that performance I mentioned, the sort of really dramatic one with the soldiers. The soldiers leave and there's this sort of sense of victory and joy from it. But the second performance is a more popular one with a big name actor as part of it. He is also in this surrounded by people dressed as soldiers because they want the kind of simulacrum of the first performance, this idea that the tension created by having Israeli guards in the room heightened the performance of the actors. So what happens if you then retain that sense of unease in the audience by having people dressed in army uniforms at the beginning, only to sort of realize that they are just actors? Does that still maximize that performance for the audience by creating this sort of simulacrum of the environment, of the danger? And I think the book does something really intelligent with that by kind of probing that idea of, can you ever really mirror that thing? Do you want to mirror the risk and everything of it happening? The second production of this play is still in the West Bank. It's still contextually part of this struggle and part of this this conversation with the subject matter, but it's now a slightly it's a slightly produced version with these sort of fake soldiers. However, as we see right at the very end of this book, the last page, this book then talks about how that bubble of this being a simulacrum of the real thing gets burst by soldiers bursting in, firing a shot and dispersing tear gas. And so we're reminded again of the very reality of the situation. And this sort of then lends some credence maybe to the title of the book, which is taken from a line in the play. And this idea of the ghost entering the scene then takes on again a new level, a new meaning. Is this the ghost of ancestors, people who are no longer with us, who have died as part of the struggle? Or is this the idea that actually this performance has been the final one? It kind of ends on this cliffhanger to some degree, which I think is a really bold and really intelligent ending to what is already a really thoughtful book. And so I just have lots of thoughts essentially about this book, and I really think it's very well done and very powerful. But I thought this idea particularly of stacking narratives, of sort of a play within a play, and the play speaks to both Shakespeare's time but also has a resonance with power in the current day, really throws something interesting in there, because we have this idea of rotten in the state of Denmark and all of these other kind of Shakespearean elements coming in, all of which have a resonance with anything, with sort of with many things within the sort of political sphere now. But by restaging it, we can recontextualize, we can reimagine various parts of this to whichever narrative we want to sort of speak to. But it often doesn't remove the very real nature of what is actually happening. And I think the soldiers bursting in at the end of this book sort of throws something unsettling in, because we have a performance where, this first performance where the Israeli guards leave, and it's almost this seen as like a victory of art, that, art has triumphed in speaking to these people directly and almost having this sense of reason, and they leave. But actually the second performance, they come back and, violence ensues with tear gas, with a bullet shot. And so we are reminded that behind this art and behind this this narrative, something very real is happening. And I just think that's really masterfully done. I don't think I'm doing this book justice in the way I'm talking about it here, because I think it feels even richer and more complex on the page than I'm doing it any duty in trying to describe. And it's a far more complicated political situation than I can sort of explain or know really about at all. But I think the way this book deals with art versus politics and this idea of speaking truth to power throws into sharp relief so many other discussions. And and particularly, when you sort of think of the Shakespearean context, where actually Shakespeare could write these lines, but would these be lines that could be delivered in front of a king at the time? Probably not. There's sort of a lot of hiding in plain sight in terms of the language or the phrasing or the themes of some of those plays, but often power still triumphed in some way. And I think this book toes this really interesting line in how it develops the conversations around some of those. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there. I think it's a really rich and interesting book. And I really do highly urge you to check it out. I think it's a really stunning piece of literature. I think it really addresses some really complex issues in such a beautiful way. And I'd love to hear other people's thoughts about it. I'm sure there's a lot that I've missed in the book as well. Anyway, take care. I've been Bob the Bookerer. Speak to you all very soon. And I hope you're enjoying the Women's Prize shortlist as well. Bye-bye.